Good afternoon. I'm Stephanie Harris, Senior Vice President for Resource Development at United Way. Thank you for joining What Makes Legislative Districts Fair, part of the Learn United series designed to highlight the narratives of a variety of voices in our community. John Gilligan will be our moderator for today's discussion. John is a partner with the Ice Miller Law Firm and focuses his practice on resolving or trying difficult business disputes. John is a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers. He has been recognized in the Best Lawyers in America as the Lawyer of the Year 2022 in Bet the Company litigation, and Ohio Super Lawyers as one of the top 50 lawyers in Columbus and top 100 lawyers in Ohio. He is also ranked by Chambers USA for his practice in general commercial litigation. John devotes a substantial amount of time to pro bono work, both nationally and in Ohio. He served as co-chair of the Access to Justice and Legal Services Committee of the American College of Trial Lawyers and as chair of the Board of Trustees of the Legal Aid Society of Columbus, chair of the Ohio State Bar Association Access to Justice Committee, and 2017 recipient of the Ohio Legal Assistance Foundation's President's Award for his pro bono work. John served as Ohio counsel to President Obama in 2008 and 2012, and co-chaired Ohio Promote the Vote from 2006 through 2018. And John is a loyal supporter and friend of United Way. John Gilligan.
Stephanie, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my privilege to moderate this panel on a very important topic, redistricting, what makes a district fair. As Stephanie has indicated to you, I am a trial lawyer at Ice Miller. More important for this discussion is I have been practicing law for 45 years, but I have been involved in politics for much longer. I am the son of the former governor of Ohio, Jack Gilligan. I am the brother of the former governor of Kansas, Kathleen Sebelius. I grew up in a family where we regarded politics as a fall sport. And my work is really what we're interested in today. Is not my work as a trial lawyer, but the perspectives that I have found over the years of working on political campaigns. And we talk about the importance of democracy in this country, but really, we don't have a democracy. We have a representational democracy. And that is, we elect people to go to Columbus or to go to Washington, D.C. to represent us because we're busy trying to make a living, trying to raise a family. And we expect those people to act in our interest, to do things that would help improve our lives. And our ability to choose those representatives is very much impacted by how the maps are drawn, how the districts are drawn, who are the candidates we have an opportunity to vote for. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. And that is a process, the map drawing process occurs every 10 years as the districts are adjusted based on population. So for example, in Ohio, this cycle, Ohio has lost a representative to Congress. So we will go from 16 representatives to 15 representatives. And so that requires the districts to be redrawn. And our panel will talk to you about how those districts are drawn, what are the considerations that are important in drawing the maps to try to make them fair. And let me just also say, I am what is known as a yellow dog Democrat. That is, if a yellow dog were the nominee of the Democratic Party, likely I would be voting for the yellow dog. But I am aware of my partisan bias. And our discussion today will try to leave behind our partisan biases and really discuss these issues as if everyone were acting in good faith with the best intentions and not acting out of a simply out of a partisan perspective. So that's what we're going to try to do. And I apologize in advance to the extent that it becomes partisan in tone. We will try not to let that happen. So let me introduce the panel. First, we have Ranthony Edmonds. She is everything that I am not. She is a National Science Foundation Mathematical and Physical Sciences postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Mathematics at The Ohio State University. She is PhD from Iowa. She has multiple master's degrees and an undergrad from Kentucky. She has worked on the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission, and you'll hear about that and the work that she did. And her remarks will focus on the quantitative perspectives of redistricting, the challenges involved in quantifying gerrymandering and the possibilities that are offered by bringing computational theories to redistricting. The second panelist we have is Gregory Moore. Greg has been a voting rights activist working at the national and state level in key leadership positions for over 2 decades. I met Greg probably 20 years ago, and 20 years ago, he had a very well-established reputation in this field, both nationally and in Ohio. He has expertise in the areas of voter registration, election protection, election administration, and conducting grassroots voter mobilization programs. He served as the co-chair of the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission, and you'll hear about that, an independent, nonpartisan, statewide 15-person commission. They have been hosting public hearings for community input, collecting data for map making, and supporting public education on the redistricting process. And you'll hear from Greg and also from Anthony about what happened to all of that information that they gathered from the public hearings. Greg currently serves as the president and CEO of Promise of Democracy Foundation, an Ohio-based organization to carry out his ongoing democracy building advocacy activities. And finally, we have Steve Huffner, who will be joining us. He has actually been delayed flying back from Atlanta. We have heard that he is on the ground and he will join us shortly. He is the C. William O'Neill Professor of Law at Moritz. For those of you who have been in Ohio for a while, you know that C. William O'Neill was both a former governor of Ohio and a former Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court. So it's a very honored faculty position at the Moritz School of Law. Stephen was a graduate of Harvard and of Columbia Law School. He clerked for the DC Circuit and also had a stint in private practice at the law firm of Covington and Burling. For our purposes, he is the Deputy Director of Election Law and the Director of the Clinical Programs at Moritz College of Law. He is the author of a number of articles and several books, including From Registration to Recounts, the Election Ecosystems of 5 Midwestern States. So he will not only talk to us from the perspective of what's going on in Ohio, but also what other states are doing to try to deal with this very important issue of redistricting. So let's start the discussion. Let me ask Greg Moore to kick us off and describe the effort, the goal of the Fair Districts constitutional amendments in Ohio. that were passed overwhelmingly with bipartisan support. What was the intention? And then describe to us kind of what has happened in terms of gathering citizen input to provide to the legislators and office holders who are actually drawing the maps.
Well, first, thank you, John, for this opportunity to be a part of this conversation, and good to see Anthony again. We worked together on the Ohio Citizens District Commission and the United Way family for the work you've done in keeping this issue highlighted. I want to just add, I am a graduate of Ohio University, so I am a Buckeye from Southeast Ohio there, and just graduated recently from the Voinovich School with my master's in public administration. So I've gotten a lot of fresh information about the way our public policy can be impacted by the important work that we're doing here. John, I want to just step back and say that we started this process with the census. In 2020, we knew there was going to be a possibility of losing a seat in Ohio. And so our organization, the Promise of Democracy, and the Ohio Voter Fund, and the League of Women Voters, and all these advocacy groups worked through a coalition to make sure we got as many people signed up as possible. COVID, of course, came, and that threw off the regular work that's being done to get people counted. Door-to-door campaigns, numerators were delayed, and subsequently the data from the census was delayed into the process of 2021's redistricting. That was, for some of us, an unfortunate situation because it did allow for problems of undercounting to still take place. But for people who didn't have the interest of getting this reform together, it was maybe an unnecessary, or it was probably something that was used as maybe more of a stall tactic. But there was a reform movement in this state, 2015 and 2018. The voters of Ohio from around the state passed 2 constitutional amendments that reformed the process of redistricting. And these were not just amendments that were passed in 5 or 6 counties across the state and everybody else went the other way. This was a reform that passed by over 70% in every single county of Ohio. 88 of the 88 counties supported this initiative. It was bipartisan in nature. It was bipartisan in its approach to give a more representative voice for people in the state of Ohio and drawing their maps. So the legislative and congressional process have constitutional backing and the support of the voters of Ohio, and the legislature, which helped move these ballot measures on, and the coalition, Fair Districts Ohio, as well as Equal Districts. These were all advocates who worked for several years to see this moment come. The Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission was formed early in 2021 by the NAACP and the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, as well as the A. Philip Randolph Institute and several other allies, to bring together a cross-section of advocates from around the state to talk about the importance of hearing the voices of Ohio. We held several hearings across the state virtually because we were still in the midst of COVID, but we emphasized each region of the state. Those hearings dictated how we would view the map making process. People were asked to give their communities of interest, map out their communities of interest. And in many cases, we created a portal that people and advocates could submit their own maps on what they thought was a representative sampling of their community. This information was gathered through a portal with over 2,000 submissions. We had hearings and testimonies of over 450 testimonies over the course of 7 months. And we used that information to form the Ohio Citizens Redistricting maps that Anthony and others who helped us throughout this process, including folks at Tufts University. We had a number of people, experts, advocates, lawyers involved with making sure that the maps that we drew were in fact in line with the Constitution. So this was a long process. It involved the voters of Ohio. It included every single thing we could do to ensure that the Constitution was adhered to. And we engaged members of the Ohio Redistricting Commission, members of the legislature, and 3 branches, and the executive branch, as well as the legislative leaders. People like me actually worked and spoke out and reached out to people like Secretary of State LaRose and Auditor Faber at the hearings. We sent people to hearings. We asked them to come and be a part of the process. And so we feel that the maps that we submitted to the legislature and to the Ohio Redistricting Commission did in fact represent the split that represents the 10 years that the voters of Ohio had voted. So we want to make sure there was I think it was 46 to 54 split among the legislative and the congressional seats. And finally, just to wrap up, but I know you want to hear from the other panelists, we believe that this process was fairly put on the ballot and instituted, but the people, the Ohio Redistricting Commission charged with implementing this plan failed to do their job. And they have time after time rejected the calls of the Supreme Court as well as the voters and the people who testified to follow the Constitution, do their job, meet and pass maps that represent the voters of Ohio. And I hope we can talk more about that as we get through the process.
Thank you very much, Greg. I should have said it at the beginning, just to kind of set the stage a little bit. Part of the process with the constitutional amendment for drawing the General Assembly districts, those are the people who represent us in Columbus, was that there would be the governor, the Secretary of State, the auditor, and that there would be 4 members of the legislature, a Republican member of the Senate, a Republican member of the House, a Democratic member of the Senate, and a Democratic member of the House. And in order to get a map that would last for 10 years, in order to encourage some political compromise, the map needs to get the support of 2 of the minority party. That would be the 2 Democrats. So the process has not worked to get any support from the minority on the commission. And that's kind of where we are. Let me ask Ranthony, who has a very, I think, compelling graphic that she's going to show us about what is the impact of redistricting, where you draw the lines, why is that important for who represents you, and how the partisan makeup of the legislature can be changed. So, Ranthony, why don't you get to the description for us of why how you draw the lines is so important.
Okay, so I also want to just thank the other panelists and John for the invitation and the United Way for hosting this conversation. So I'm really, and this was noted before, want to provide some perspective on how do we sort of quantify this notion of fairness, to begin with the initial prompt of sort of trying to understand why the way that we draw the lines matters so much. This actually isn't an image that I showed earlier, but here's an example of North Carolina, unfortunately not Ohio, but there are 5 different maps that you see drawn here. And one thing that I wanted to note is that when you draw a districting plan, they're beholden to certain what we call redistricting principles. And so we have something called contiguity, which means that you can't have a district that's made up of disconnected pieces. An extreme example would be you can't take a little piece of Cleveland, a little piece of Columbus, and call that a district. They're not connected geographically. We also have a principle called population balance. And so all districts roughly have to have the same size, and how strict, that equality is, it depends on the type of district. For congressional districts, there's usually only one person standard deviation from each one to the next, but it varies a little bit more for the districts where we're electing people for the General Assembly. And so one thing I wanted to talk about with related to the effort that Greg was describing is that the group that I was working with at Ohio State and some other universities, including Tufts, we wanted to understand what it would mean to sort of quantify a notion of fairness. So there exists metrics for determining whether or not a given districting plan is fair. One thing that doesn't exist is some way to sort of quantify whether or not a community of interest has been split using computers. So we have ways to show if a county or a particular municipality is being split when we generate a districting plan, but the idea of a community of interest is a lot more vague. So what we wanted to do with the testimony that we received is to receive an actual spatialized map of a community that we could then use to input into maps like the ones that Greg mentioned that the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission created. I did want to talk a little bit about why computational redistricting is so important, I think. One reason is that there's sort of two ways to assess a map. We tend to look at its partisan leaning through its geometry, through scores like its compactness score, et cetera. And there are a number of metric and ways to do this. We also sort of look at it through its partisan leaning with measures like the efficiency gap. The issues with these sorts of tools is that they don't comprehensively take into account the geometry of a state, its population, its demographics. And so in the last 10 years or so, we've seen the advent of computational redistricting. And so what you see here are 5 maps. What if I wanted to make 20,000, right? Or 30,000 or 1 million? This is sort of the approach that is being taken to understanding redistricting from a quantitative perspective. If we want to evaluate the fairness of a particular map, what we can do is establish a baseline of comparison by generating thousands and thousands of alternative plans. And computational tools allow us to do this in such a way that we are only building the maps with nonpartisan criteria, population balance, compactness scores, contiguity scores, and metrics that put restraints on what we can cut and not cut in terms of counties and municipalities. And so I wanted to demonstrate a little bit of what this looks like, and then I will stop monopolizing the screen. I am going to share in the chat to everyone a really nice article about explaining some of these phenomenons. But one thing that's been happening is that people have been providing expert testimony in court cases using sort of example plots like this. So this is a box and whisker plot. The way that you sort of look at this is that this morning I generated 1,000 redistricting plans. And so I pick a plan and I use a computer script to generate 1,000 optional plans. And then I want to kind of look at what's happening if I fix an election. So if I fix the presidential 2016 election versus Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, I'm going to wait. Yes. Yes. These are the correct. No, that was 2000 and my years are off. That was 2020. Who was 2016?
Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump.
Okay, yes, it didn't sound right. Okay, just making sure you guys are with me. So the way that you read this is that the boxes represent 50% of the of sort of what happened in the ensemble. So in District 0, right, and I have my stylus tool. Here's District 0, right? This is where the distribution in that district lied within my 10,000 plans for my particular presidential election. This says that in the 0 district, when I ran my plans and I looked at the percentage of voters in those districts in each of those plans, around almost 30% at a median voted Democratically, right? And so what I can do is I kind of develop summary statistics for what's going to happen in a given election based on this collection of plans that are developed with neutral criteria. And the way that this is ordered is from least Democratic to most Democratic. So what you can see is that not even factoring in, this is sort of factoring in the political geography of the state because it's developed with non-neutral, with neutral criteria, is that maybe we're going to get this many sort of Republican districts. These districts, right, are hovering at around 50% for the total number of Democrats. And these districts you see are sort of going to be safely Democratic. So we kind of have 3 competitive districts, 3 that are locked in, and then 9 that are sort of strongly Republican. What happens and why this approach has gained traction in court cases is that we can pick a particular plan and compare it to an ensemble. So this is, unfortunately, I don't remember which one of the unconstitutional plans for Ohio. I think it's the very first one from last year. It's unfortunate that there are multiple ones to choose from, but this is, for instance, how that plan falls within this distribution. So for instance, if we look at District 14, which these are numbered from 0 to 14 for a total of 15, this says that the congressional plan put forth by the Ohio Redistricting Commission is an extreme outlier. So if I create a computer software that generates 10,000 plans, and within those 10,000 plans in this particular district, it's pretty average that we're gonna have about 60% of individuals voting for a Democratic Party. This says that in that particular plan, you have an overrepresentation that's even beyond the outliers for the ensemble method. So these methods are sometimes referred to as outlier analysis techniques, and it's a way that you can sort of identify packing and cracking. I won't manipulate the time anymore, but I want to sort of just highlight that there are sort of a lot of efforts that are being put forth, especially in the last 10 years, to quantify some of these notions of fairness and to develop tools that will highlight, not just how one plan compares to another, but to establish a baseline of thousands and thousands of plans and then highlight where that plan falls in the distribution. And if you have a plan that is an extreme outlier, this indicates that you had to be trying really hard to draw a plan that has these results. So I'll stop here, and I'm very happy to answer any questions, but I don't want to manipulate the time anymore. But the main thing I want to just focus on is that I would love to talk to anyone about computational redistricting. It does have its pros and cons, and I think that we can kind of talk about that later on in the conversation.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was very helpful. I can see now that Steve has joined us. Welcome. You win the award for having traveled the furthest to be on the panel, and we appreciate all your effort. Let me ask you to kind of bring us up to date on where the various lawsuits and challenges to the different maps in Ohio, where do they stand? And what are we looking at over the near future?
Sure. Thanks, John. And thanks to Stephanie and the United Way for putting this together. And although I traveled today, I'm home. All right. I'm not traveling far from home to do this. And I'm delighted to be part of this conversation about Ohio in particular, but maybe more generally redistricting processes and alternatives. So, John, as you said, the process that Greg described, or the processes really that Greg described that are now spelled out in the Ohio Constitution, have led to litigation, as many of our audience, I'm sure, is already aware of. The provisions in the Ohio Constitution provided that the Ohio Supreme Court would have what we lawyers call original jurisdiction over challenges to the maps that the processes produced. And what that means is that anyone who wanted to challenge a map that came out of this process got to go straight to the Ohio Supreme Court. The Ohio Supreme Court then has considered now several challenges. And I think it's important to reflect on the title of our panel discussion today, what makes legislative districts fair, that at least one dimension of what the proponents of these two amendments, which as Greg described, were overwhelmingly supported by the citizens of Ohio, they wanted a process that would allow judicial review of what the Redistricting Commission or the state legislature had done as part of that fairness. Now, in addition to just the bare fact of judicial review, the fact that the Ohio Supreme Court has original jurisdiction here, we also have in the two relevant amendments to the Ohio Constitution a set of standards or criteria that are to be followed. And as Ranthony said, we have tools to do these kinds of things. Ranthony's description of some of these computational mathematical contributions, I think, is really rich and important. And in particular, the way those tools can show the extent to which an actual map is a real outlier with respect to, in the case of the slides that Ranthony was showing, the partisan effects. You could also look at other dimensions of the districts that have been drawn, and there are choices to be made about different criteria that we might want to prioritize in our districts, including things like compactness and preservation of existing communities of interest, and not dividing municipalities unnecessarily, and not dividing counties more than necessary, and so on. And those things are spelled out in these constitutional amendment sections as well. The proponents, the citizens of Ohio who voted for this, were adopting a set of those tools that directed the Redistricting Commission, but not in all regards. So, the Redistricting Commission still itself had to make some choices or to balance some things. So at the end of the day, we have these maps coming out of this process, and then they've been challenged before the Ohio Supreme Court on the basis that there's something about a given map that isn't compliant with what these provisions in the state constitution have required. And in particular, the challenges to both the congressional maps as well as the maps for the state legislative districts have been challenged on the basis of the sort of favor of a political party. The article of the Constitution that governs the drawing of the Ohio General Assembly, our state legislature, says that those districts cannot be drawn primarily to favor or disfavor a particular political party. The language in Article 19, which governs the drawing of our congressional districts, is slightly different, although it says in a quite analogous way that the maps cannot unduly favor a particular political party. And the Ohio Supreme Court, each time it's looked at the maps that have been produced this cycle, has concluded that the maps violate that dimension of the state constitution, that they do primarily favor a particular political party or unduly favor a particular political party. And so they've found the maps to be unconstitutional and asked the Redistricting Commission, in the case of the General Assembly map, asked the General Assembly initially in the case of the congressional map to do it again. Now, the awkward dimension of all of this is that the constitutional amendment that governs the drawing of the state legislative maps provides that the Ohio Supreme Court does not have the power to impose its own map or to direct the Redistricting Commission to adopt any particular map. And so we've seen a back and forth where the court strikes a map down and tells the commission to do it again. And we've now had 4 different maps be invalidated. And in theory, the state Supreme Court had required the Redistricting Commission to produce a new map, and they essentially didn't. There is now pending before the Ohio Supreme Court a request or a motion filed by the petitioners to hold the Redistricting Commission in contempt of court for not having responded properly to what the court had asked. Whether the court will do that is still an open question. The objections to being held in contempt were just filed, I think, this morning. So we'll see what happens on the contempt issue. But there's still a bigger question of whether the Ohio Supreme Court itself is going to once again invalidate the map. I'm talking now about the maps for the state legislature. And the really interesting wrinkle here is that we now have a federal court involved as well. And the federal court announced a few weeks ago that if the state process, and by that they really mean the back and forth between the Ohio Supreme Court and the Redistricting Commission, if that back and forth has not produced what the state process concludes is a constitutional map, by the end of this month, the federal court announced it would impose itself one of the earlier maps that the state Supreme Court had already declared unconstitutional. And that's just a really interesting dynamic. Now, that doesn't, and I should say the predicate for the federal district court having announced that intention was the federal district court's own conclusion about Ohio's primary election structure and by when the state would have to hold a primary election for the state map in order to have those candidates determined for the general election in November. But you know, this is a matter of state law. And if the Ohio Supreme Court wanted to say the primary needs to be held at a later date, or even that the general election needs to be held at a later date, that, in my view, would be within the state Supreme Court's power, and it would essentially undermine the predicate the federal district court had identified for why it was preparing to impose a map itself. I should say one more thing about the federal court's involvement here. There is a federal law issue, and the federal law issue here, well, there are actually a couple, but the one in particular that was underlying the federal court's previous announced intention is that the districts that we use to elect our representatives have to be, as Anthony said, essentially equal in population. And we don't have districts like that right now that comply with that equal population requirement, which is a federal law requirement. And so on that basis, the federal court feels like it can say, well, the map that the commission itself adopted the second time around, even though it wasn't constitutional under Ohio law because it was found to unduly favor a particular political party, would still comply with the equal population requirement of federal law, or what we call the one person, one vote requirement. So that's where we are with respect to the state legislative map. One brief comment on the congressional map. The second map produced there after the Ohio Supreme Court invalidated the first map is still before the Ohio Supreme Court, but it's been handling that challenge on a slower timetable because the parties essentially gave up trying to aggressively get that challenge resolved before the primary election that we held 9 days ago. So we'll see what happens to the congressional map. There is a federal lawsuit also challenging that federal map on the basis that a couple of the districts don't comply with the federal law we call the Voting Rights Act. And I better leave it there because I think I'm taking too much time, but I'm happy to respond to questions as we go forward.
Let me just ask you to define for the audience a term which is often thrown about with unfair districts, the term gerrymandering. So give us a short definition that we can use of what is meant by gerrymandering.
Yeah, so often we think of it as the representatives picking their voters rather than voters picking their representatives. It's the drawing of districts in order to try to maximize the chances that the people drawing the districts will get an outcome that they want. And it's done by drawing lines that would not sort of naturally be drawn to keep municipalities together or to provide the representatives with a relatively compact geographic space in which to go out and meet, conduct town hall meetings, become acquainted with their constituents. So that's sort of a quick.
I was thinking it would be a good time to actually share that first graphic.
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. And while you're putting that up, let me just respond to Melanie's comment about using the word absurd rather than interesting. It reminds me of the old joke about the woman who went to charm school and learned to say, well, isn't that just interesting rather than BS? So that's where we are.
So I think, yeah, this sort of gets it. two questions that came up. One was about what is compactness, and it's typically something that you sort of have an eyeball for. Like I can eye and map and tell you whether or not the district shapes are sort of irregular. So for instance, here you see current, meaning the last enacted map. This region here was sometimes referred to as the snake on the lake. And this would be sort of an example of a district shape that's highly irregular in terms of like a polygon versus here in this example, the shapes are compact, but perhaps not going to align very nicely with county borders that exist. And here you have something that's much nicer. So you have, and then one example also to note is that these are all valid ways to split the state into the certain number of districts that are required. So with respect to gerrymandering, if you know how people are going to vote, you can manipulate the districts to sort of tweak the outcomes in your favor. So I really like this graphic because let's say you have a district or a state population of 50 people, and you need to create 5 districts. And so here in this left-hand panel, you just see information about how people are voting. So you have 20 people that vote red and 30 people that vote blue, just represented by each block. So if you're trying to create 5 districts and you want them all to have the same amount of people, each district will have 10. And so here's one way to do it. You can draw 5 districts with, 10 blocks each. The first way that you do it, you end up having representation that's proportional to the population of people. The second way that you do it, notice what happens. We still have 10 people per block, but if we're holding an election and everyone votes, you're always going to have 6 blue people in each district and 4 red. And so even though the blue population is 60%, they're dominating, they're forming a supermajority of the districts, and the red population is now having no say and not able to elect a representative. Now you can get more creative. And this is why compactness is one of the traditional redistricting criteria, because you can sort of draw a district in an interesting shape to scoop in, right, people who are going to vote a particular way, and then advance, right, the number of seats that your particular party may have. So in this last image, and right, this is just a toy example, it's just a grid, but in this last image, you see that the red district has sort of drawn kind of irregularly shaped districts, but now they've achieved a higher number of seats in proportion to how many people there actually are in the population. So gerrymandering is this practice of really drawing the lines to sort of overtly, in many cases, advantage your particular party. And we're seeing this in Ohio, so to an extreme degree. And I hope that that's helpful. I'll stop my screen share now.
I'll just say one quick thing, Anthony. Those are great graphics, and I think that's really helpful. The number 1 that you had up there, which was the vertical districting that you described as sort of perfect representation in terms of the number of districts matching the share of the total voters. The one thing to just observe about that one is none of those districts would be competitive as a matter of, the general election between the parties. And so that becomes another question that districtors think about, in addition to things like compactness and communities of interest, also competitiveness, which may or may not be important, but it's something to think about.
I think, and just to reiterate, so competitiveness, for those who may not be familiar, is sort of how close the given vote lines in a particular area kind of hover around, and correct me if I'm wrong, around 50%. And so it could sort of go either way in a given election. And so you really do need to mobilize and have people come out versus another district where it's kind of pretty set who your representative is going to be and which party they're going to be from. One question or one note is that in this graphic, it also implicitly kind of assumes that proportional representation is the ideal. It's what we want. And that's not something that's always aligned as a reality, given the geopolitical makeup of a state.
So let me ask Greg to jump back into the conversation. And I think it was Ranthony who talked about the redistricting principles. What are the things that we hold important in drawing what we regard as fair districts. And the term compactness has been talked about, contiguity, competitiveness. If you would just kind of talk about, Greg, those issues and what you saw in terms of the response or input from the public with the various meetings that you had around the state, of why those were important or not important to members of the public.
Well, the overall concern of voters was that they were in charge of the process of choosing their representatives and not the representative choosing them. And so when you have issues of compactness or competitiveness, obviously what we've seen in Ohio is extreme gerrymandering, where there's a 66% supermajority of all the seats in the legislature, when we all know that in the last several presidential and gubernatorial elections, the split was more closer to 54 to 46%. So extreme gerrymandering is when you basically ignore that general principle. And that was one of the basic principles of the constitutional amendment, that communities of interest could step forward and say, we see ourselves as a community that needs to be represented in this in particular district. And the competitiveness issue was important because obviously if we were in seats where there was no chance of a person of a different party being elected because of the way the lines were gerrymandered, then there was no chance for people in that community to have their voices heard. So the things like the mistake on the lake that Anthony showed was examples of legislators, 10 years ago, taking advantage of the current law back then and basically only drawing districts along the lines that made sure they secured the election of their party for the 10-year period. We created a process in the redistricting reform movement that put a more protracted process in place where we would force bipartisan discussion, bipartisan map making, bipartisan collective processes to get to the point where maps could be passed on a bipartisan basis. Unfortunately, the legislative track presented a process where there's a somewhat now convoluted process of there being 3 steps that you have to take in order to get to those maps. So as you mentioned, John, the redistricting commission made up of 7 members, only 2 of those members were Democrats. And so if you have a 5-2 super majority on the redistricting commission, the only way this thing could work is if there was bipartisan on the part of the people with the majority. And so there was certainly efforts throughout the entire process of the Democratic members working to try and present maps that were along the lines that were spelled out in the Constitution, with the 54, the 46 split, with maps that the map that Anthony laid out was the kind of things that experts were involved in throughout that whole process in 2021 to ensure that we met all the constitutional guidelines, and that the engagement of voters through hearings, through submission of maps and through the portals was a part of their concern that they be informed and a part of that process. We met for 6 to 7 months from May until September, and even until October of 2021, whereas the Ohio Redistricting Commission didn't start meeting until very, very late in the process. So there was less time for people to become engaged, to offer maps, for maps to be considered. And when there was a court-ordered map drawing process that asked them to have independent map makers brought in to draw the maps, that process did take place. It was done online. People were able to watch the map drawing take place 24/7. And at the moment and the hour that the map drawers were ready to present their maps to the commission that were drawn on a bipartisan basis, the redistricting commission, the Ohio Redistricting Commission, hijacked that process and basically imposed the same maps that had already been rejected by the Ohio Supreme Court with a very small tweak. And that's the map that was rejected. So what you've had is basically a runaway train of ongoing maps being presented that are known to be unconstitutional, running out the clock to keep this process from becoming complete. So at the end of the day, these lawsuits have not played themselves out. So in many ways, we don't know the conclusion of this story, but we do know that the 4 Supreme Court rulings thus far clearly state that the process undertaken by the Ohio Redistricting Commission was not constitutional. And we are now involved in the process of trying to see if we can get the ruling of get the commission to meet and just pass a fair map. Without that process in place, these maps will only go into effect for this cycle in 2022, considering they may very well be imposed by the federal court. And Steve can talk more about that. But the process of having a 10-year map, unlike other states across the United States, Ohio's not going to have that opportunity. We're going to be living in this world of uncertainty in the 2024 election, probably as well as the 2026 election. And so we are really disserved by this commission, led by members of the legislature who know better. In fact, the co-chair of the commission is a former Supreme Court justice himself, Speaker Huff. So to have him define the body that he once led in the middle of a process that clearly states that what they're doing is unconstitutional is actually unconscionable.
I do think
this is us with our nonpartisan hats on. You can imagine when we're in private how partisan we can get. Steve, I was going to ask you to, if you could focus, because there's a question from the audience about how can we get to fair maps, and in at least one of the opinions, and maybe in multiple opinions, both the Chief Justice O'Connor and Justice Bruner suggested that we may need to go to the ballot again and come up with a different process where there is more citizen involvement and less professional political or politician involvement. So maybe if you could give us some perspective on what some other states are doing and whether that may offer some hope to us.
Sure. It is worth observing that in the first round of these decisions, as you said, John, a couple of members of our Supreme Court were themselves expressing some skepticism about the process that we're in the middle of. Whether we will get fair maps out of this process, as Greg said, is still not fully determined. It does still depend on what the Ohio Supreme Court does. If you're measuring fairness by compliance with the requirements of the 2 amendments to the Ohio Constitution, which it's up to the Supreme Court to adjudicate, and they keep striking these maps down and could continue to do that. The tricky question at this point is what's the remedy when we're halfway through the election year, but there are still possibilities there this year, and even if not that, we could have fair maps for the 2024 election as a result of this very process. But at the end of the day, it may be that we don't like this process much as we aspired to have it work. And there are other things out there. And the best alternative to what we've experienced here are states that have created some kind of independent redistricting commission or citizens redistricting commission. And there are different models out there. I think Arizona is the first of the independent redistricting commissions that I can think of, and they've been doing that since the 2000 cycle. So they've now had 3 cycles in Arizona, 3 of these decennial redistricting cycles using their independent redistricting commission. California adopted a more complicated citizens redistricting commission that they began using in 2010. Michigan adopted its own version of a citizens redistricting commission that they use for the first time just this cycle. And each of these have slightly different or significantly different features about how the citizens or the independent members of the redistricting commission are selected and impaneled. And I won't belabor that right now, just in the interest of time. There are also places that rely on a professional staff agency. Iowa is the principal example of this. And Iowa's not necessarily an easily transferable model to other states. Iowa is mostly rural with a couple of big cities. The rural areas are divided into counties that are very compact and look very rectilinear across the whole state of Iowa. And the legislature has tasked their Legislative Services Bureau to draw the maps in the first instance. Now, the legislature still has to approve the maps that are produced by the staff agency, but if the legislature doesn't approve it, then it goes back to the agency to do it again on a nonpartisan basis using some of these nonpartisan criteria that we've talked about today. So those are some of the things that are out there that we might look at if there is an interest in reshaping it again, how Ohio does it.
John, if I could say just real quick, we are going to have maps and we are going to have an election in November. And I have to say that the maps that we are going to get will not be as hyper gerrymandered as they were in 2010. So it's going to be back up to the voters to come back in these new districts and to forget about what's being discussed in the national news. Did your representative stand with you on your redistricting desire to change this process? And those people will be held accountable by the voters of Ohio. So we should see what happens, but that will be the final arbitrator of these maps. But for a process where you had, the first map was passed on the 19th of September, 2021. It was struck down in January of 2022. The second one was passed on the 22nd of January. It was struck down on February 7th. The third set of map was passed on February 24th. They were struck down on March 16th. The fourth set passed on March 28th, struck down April 14th. The fifth one passed the 5th of May. You're starting to get this pattern here. We should have been already working on these maps and working on getting people out to vote, but instead the process has been hijacked. So
can I say one quick thing? Greg said with great confidence we will have an election in November, and I want to amend that. We will have an election in November for our 15 congressional districts because federal law establishes that as the election day. I also think it's likely we will have an election in November for our state legislature, but that, in my view, is not a foregone conclusion because even though the date for that is set as well, that's state law, and the Ohio Supreme Court, if it wants to say we cannot conduct that election for our state offices until we have a constitutional map, has the power to do that if they want to. I don't know whether they will.
Well, that should give us all a vision of hope and clarity for the upcoming election. And I think, unfortunately, we have run out of time. So I think Stephanie is going to join us to give some closing remarks. I would like to thank the panelists who I think have done a sensational job and really appreciate them giving their time to this effort. Stephanie, are you there?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, John, Anthony, Steve, and Greg, for a really informative and interesting discussion. Thank you to all of our participants for your wonderful questions. United Way is a trusted partner in Central Ohio. We will continue to bring these kinds of questions to our community. We hope that you will continue to participate in other discussions through Learn United. Our next discussion will be on May the 24th, hosted by our Women United group, and it will be the disparate impact of COVID, particularly on the lives of women and children. So thank you very, very much. We look forward to another great conversation in weeks to come. And thanks again to our moderator, John, to our panelists, Anthony, Steve, and Greg. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
thank you. Bye-bye.